And before we get going with our content for tonight, so we're gonna talk about being new to the board and what do I need to know. Before we jump into the content, sorry. Hello, Jeanette, joining us from Thunder Bay, Northwest Community Health Centers. That's awesome. Thanks for greeting, Jeanette, Rob. Just before we get started though, the 4 people who are in the webinar now, are any of you new to the board? If so, just write yes. So if you are new to the board, and let's define new as in, it's your first year on a board, maybe your first month. So we have Jeanette and another. If the person wishes to share their name with us, that would be great. V Higginson. If you want to, you can. If you don't want to, you're not obligated to share your name. But if you want me to call you by your name, Vanessa, wonderful. Thanks, Vanessa. Great. So we have Vanessa, Jeanette, Sonia, and Nathalie. 10 years on another, but they all function differently. Okay, so first years. All right, awesome. And another question just before we get the ball rolling here on the content for tonight. Are any of you in a role on the board where you are likely, very likely, or definitely gonna be responsible for onboarding new members? Anyone in the webinar tonight? Yes and yes. And yes to you as well, Rob, we are recording. So thank you, Sonia, for responding. So Sonia, yes, you definitely are in a role where you will be onboarding or have onboarded people before. You're the ED, so it's part of your job to onboard board members, directors, okay? Cool, awesome. Hopefully you get something out of this, tips and tricks perhaps. That will be not just applicable to you, but maybe some tips that you'll be able to use with the board members that you will onboard. So I'm new to the board. What do I need to know? That is what we are discussing tonight. This webinar is brought to you by CIOG, the Center for Excellence in Organizational Governance. We also thank our partners, l'Assemblée de la Francophonie de l'Ontario. Although they purposefully contribute to French webinars for the nonprofit sector, Francophone nonprofit sector, they are happy to contribute to our bilingual programmation as well. So let's get started. I'm new to the board. What do I need to know? So who's this webinar for? Well, new board members who want to integrate quickly, make a difference from the get-go, and understand the structure and dynamics of a board. And as I was saying before, or this kind of explains why I asked you before, will you be responsible for onboarding or have you onboarded before? So the topic at hand tonight is useful also for the person or perhaps the committee responsible for onboarding new members, ensuring they receive crucial information for a successful integration. We're going to get into very, very practical stuff in just a few slides. In case we have some, people who just recently joined a board members, I'm just going to go over a few basics, okay, guys? So bear with me here. What's a nonprofit organization? I'm sure we all know this, but let's go through it quickly. It's a private organization. So the nonprofit is not a public business. You do not have the same accountability channels as the government, for example. It is not because you get government funding that you are accountable to the taxpayer. Just remember, your nonprofit is a private organization, but it has no share capital. So there are no shareholders in the nonprofit. We do have a level of accountability as it's not our money. And you are totally right, Sonia, and here's to who. When you receive money from the government to do a program or something, or if you're in education, maybe you are, you receive money from the government to provide education, right? So that might be one sector that could be particular. If you are not in the education sector and you receive a certain amount of money from a specific funder, government funder, to offer a certain program or a certain service, you are accountable to that funder. Don't get me wrong. So accountability to someone, yes, to your funder. The only thing the concept I'm bringing forward here, or that we always bring up in our trainings, is as a nonprofit, there has been in the past this idea that because you receive government funds, you are accountable directly to the taxpayer, for example. You're not. You're accountable to your funder, right? There's the accountability. You are accountable to the funder. You must report to the funder on how you're using the money and A, B, C, and D. That's your direct accountability line. So nonprofit, private organization, no share capital. If there are surpluses at the end of the year as a nonprofit, that's allowed. You are just not allowed to distribute it to anyone. Any surplus that could be generated by a nonprofit must be reinvested within its mission in the organization itself. We all know various nonprofits, right? They are active in all sectors: cultural, social, scientific, artistic, professional, sports, you name it, community services. Nonprofits may engage in any social or even commercial activities related to its purpose. Its purpose as outlined in its governance documents, in its letters patent, or whatever incorporation document you have as a nonprofit. En français, les objets, the purpose that is stated in your statutes, that is what will guide your permission to conduct commercial activities as a nonprofit. Because you could decide tomorrow to sell t-shirts, for example, and generate some profit for your organization. You just can't distribute those profits. They must be reinvested in the organization after. What is governance? So a nonprofit, private organization with no share capital. If surplus are generated, they must be reinvested into the organization's mission. Then what's governance? If we're going to talk about being a good board member and being an active participant in governance, and if we're going to foster good governance, let's define together what is governance. Governance is really a management term. Governance refers to the tools, the mechanisms, the structures, and the practices that enable a board of directors of a nonprofit, specifically in this case, to make, in all situations, the best possible decisions for the organization. Good governance ensures proper management and accountability, and it helps the organization fulfill its fiduciary responsibilities, all of them, whether they be financial, legal, ethical, etc. When you think governance, what I always like to think of is tools, structures, mechanisms. Governance is basically anything your board creates, uses, develops, puts in place to be the best possible board, to create a culture of accountability. Good governance should also be focused around due diligence. It should foster due diligence. Good governance is essential in maintaining reasonable assurance that the organization is well managed. By your governance mechanism, tools, and structures, you will make sure that you are contributing to making sure that the organization is well managed. Before we get into the thick of things, the 4 legal obligations of a board member. This is probably just a refresher for most of you. You've probably seen this in a way, shape, or form since you've started your role as a board member, but let's go through them quickly. The duty of knowledge, understanding and complying with the laws and regulations that govern your organization. For example, if you're incorporated in Ontario as a nonprofit, you must abide by ANCA. If you are a school board, um, you are probably a beast of a provincial law, which means that law is one you must be familiar with, at least in the most general of terms. So, duty of knowledge. A takeaway here is pleading ignorance. If you would get into trouble as a board member or as a board, pleading ignorance is unfortunately not an option here. So, you have a duty of knowledge as a board member. You also have a duty of loyalty. So, making decisions in the best interest of the organization without external influence at all times as a board member. You are not making decisions to benefit X, Y, or Z, or your father in law, or your cousin, or your husband's sister, your sister in law. Best possible decisions for the organization. You have that duty of loyalty to the organization. I think we all know this one. The third one, confidentiality, right? Duty of confidentiality. Maintain discretion regarding board discussions. What is said around the board table should stay around the board table. I have to go there, guys, because this is one of the questions that I get asked. One of the questions I get asked most often. What exactly is confidential and what isn't in a board, around a board table? What I like to say is everything should be treated as confidential. What I do like to add is sometimes there will be information that the board will decide to communicate to a stakeholder after a board meeting or to a group of stakeholders after a meeting. What is communicated to said stakeholder or stakeholder group after a meeting should be discussed, agreed upon, and there's usually also a resolution that goes along with it. So treat the board discussions and board matters, generally speaking, as confidential. Unless there's been a discussion around the board table about certain information that should be communicated, either internally to the management team or externally to a stakeholder or a stakeholder group. And the last one, legal obligation, the duty of due diligence. This means ensuring that ensuring informed and responsible decision making. Before a board makes a decision, those decisions should be based on a minimum of looking at information, asking questions, the information we're looking at to help decision making. Where is it coming from? Is it provided by our ED and has it been looked over by the finance people or the accounting portion of our organization? Due diligence means making decisions diligently, which means, en français, I have to go there, la prudence et le soin. So I'm going to go to my next slide here. Because what is due diligence, right? So very briefly, a legal and ethical concept that refers to the obligation to act with care, prudence, and responsibility, as expected from a reasonable person in similar circumstances. I'll let you digest that for a second. I am not bright enough to have invented this. These are these are words and concepts that are ingrained in the law. If you read through ANCA, ANCA will explain due diligence in its own way, but you will see the words care and prudence in there. Due diligence means making the best possible decisions for the organization, pardon me, means acting with care, prudence, and responsibility, as would a reasonable person like yourself placed in your shoes. That is due diligence, and that is a legal obligation. So I just wanted to do this quick little overview of, in very broad terms, what are the basics of governance? Therefore, what do you need to know as a board member in very general terms? Rob, words of wisdom from
Yeah.
the great governance guru that you are?
Well, I've had a little bit of experience with governance, both as certainly as a board member of a few different boards, as well as being a director general and an executive director of organizations. And yeah, when you look at those four basic pieces, no question about it, at any time, the challenges come along the way, and it could be just in one area, and it could really make it difficult for the board and for the management team around the particular board. I mean, it's that whole piece of most people join nonprofit boards because they want to make a difference. They want to help a cause. They want to get their feet wet in governance and learn more. And nothing brings you down a little bit more than one or more of these areas being sort of compromised. I especially when you look at the due diligence piece, and we're going to talk about that a little bit later for sure. I refer to it also as the duty of care, and
Yes.
it's really that duty there is the real buy-in on your credibility that you've really put the time in and you really want to be on that particular board and make a difference. So they're very important. They're very worth reminding ourselves of. And for many of us who have worked with boards, we've seen instances when people on the board have gotten away from those areas, and everybody, I think, will play a role in bringing on new members in one way or another, even if it's just to be a colleague or a mentor to the new people. So it's good to always visit those terms. So thanks for that review, Julie. I think that's important.
Awesome. Thanks. This could also have been part of the basics of governance. Just remember, if you're new to a board, or even if you're a seasoned board member and you're responsible for onboarding people, there are different governance models out there. Is there anyone in today's webinar that has been on an operational board? Have you ever been on a board where of an organization where there are no employees? The board does everything, which means the board does operations, all of it, and the governance. Have any of you been on operational boards before? Yes, you're all volunteers. Got it. Whether you're on an operational board or on a results and oversight oriented board, you're still volunteers. You do it all. If you're on a board where there are employees, your governance model is probably more structured around results and oversight. So if you're sitting on a board of an organization where there are no employees, where the board is responsible for delivering the services, organizing the activity or activities of the organization, you're in a management oriented governance model. There will be some differences between the responsibilities of board members on an operational board versus some of the responsibilities on a person sitting on a results and oversight oriented board. Here's the main difference between the two. And I'll refer to my slide here, common governance models. Let's look at the first one. Management oriented governance means there are no employees. The board does it all. In a results and oversight oriented governance is usually a governance model used for medium-sized to large organizations that have, at the very minimum, an executive director and probably also a small management team, a small to mid-sized management team. If you are sitting on the board of an institution like a hospital or a school board, you are most likely doing policy governance, ends based governance, loosely, not loosely, but mostly based on the Carver model. Um, Interpretation of politics, policies, sorry, not politics, policies. Um, Policy governance is very much a strategic board to the next level. What I'm going to suggest for our little group is just stick to at least the first two. Understanding the difference between these two is already a step ahead because there are differences. If you're sitting on a management oriented board, a board that has no employees, a board that does operations and governance, your structure and some of your governance tools might be different. For example, your meetings might look different. The boards that are operational boards oftentimes will really separate their board meetings in two sections. They will do everything operational in one portion of the meeting. And then oftentimes, you know what they do? They get a different person to chair the second part of the meeting where they will do their governance work. Not that managing operations in an operational board is not governance, but managing programs, services, and actively managing the day-to-day of the organization is not the same thing as creating a culture of accountability on the governance side and doing all of your governance pieces and making sure you're respecting everything and making sure your policies are up to date and making sure that you're recruiting board members and all that jazz. So there are big differences between these two governance models. I'm guessing, and correct me if I'm wrong using the chat, you are probably on a board that fits with number one, management oriented, or results and oversight oriented. Is there anyone in the group tonight that is on a board that does policy governance, Carver model, institution, or very, very large organization? Is there anyone in that type of organization here tonight? Not Sonia. You are on a policy governance board, Jeanette. How big is the board? How big is the organization? How many employees? So how many board members and how many employees? If you can just put that in the chat, it'll help Rob and I to kind of tailor maybe some examples to make it as pertinent as possible for you, Jeanette. Thanks for that, guys. So just remember, different governance models might have different governance structures, tools, or mechanism. What I will say, though, is good governance is good governance. So the main principles will apply here. Governance models matter. It's the system or structure chosen by the board to ensure accountability to stakeholders. So just remember that. This governance model is very useful when we talk about organizations that are results and oversight oriented boards. This little diagram, we love it, and we created it in collaboration with our friend Jim Brown. We've adapted it to the nonprofit sector a little bit, but it's so relevant to just show who does what in this governance model. So let's remember here, the governance model we're talking about is the results-oriented and oversight governance model. That's a model where there is an executive director. In this model, as you can see, the executive director is at the very top of the pyramid, below the dotted line. Mostly below the dotted line. The executive director has its nose in the board. That makes sense when you think of the executive director's role towards the board. Isn't the executive director responsible for bringing probably close to 80%, 90% of the information regarding the organization to the board for them to, think, make strategic decisions and all that? So the executive director is mostly active below the line in the how portion of the organization, but it has its nose in the board. The people who work below the line, so the executive directors, the employees, and all that jazz, are mostly responsible for the how. So they will be the people handling operations, procedures, strategic action plans, human resources management, programs and services delivery, finance, daily finance and accounting, communication, marketing, IT, and operational risk management. And now, if you take your eye above the line, that's where the board comes in. The board, in a results oriented and oversight governance model, the board is largely responsible for the what? Strategic framework, accountability framework, specifically the executive director's accountability framework. The board will be responsible for setting policy, for monitoring and oversight, and for measuring risk appetite. This is just very, very useful, this little diagram to kind of show how things work and who's responsible for what. Executive director involved in operations mostly, has its nose in the board, is responsible for being accountable to the board, reporting to the board on results, guiding the board on strategic paths, perhaps, reporting to the board on regular finances, all this and all that. The board mostly responsible for the what, establishing the direction, accountability frameworks, etc. This can be very useful if you've never worked on a board with such a governance model. What happens if you're a new board member, perhaps, and you've never been in contact with this type of functioning? You might make a few faux pas. We want to help you not do that. So we're at the part now where we're really getting, I'm gonna use Rob's words from earlier, the nitty-gritty of today's webinar. 5 habits of an effective board member. What does an effective board member do to be effective? And this is what we're diving into now, and Rob will help me along the way with examples and all kinds of great tips and tricks for you. So the first thing you need to remember as a board member, new or even old, be prepared and be informed before every meeting. As simple as getting ready for the meeting, reviewing the agenda, reviewing the board package. Rob, how much time would you spend as an executive director, as a DG, Director General, getting a board package ready for a board meeting?
Yeah, you spend a significant amount of time. I mean, it's the thought and planning that goes into putting a kit for a meeting. For example, whether you have if you have a secretary working on it, a corporate secretary, or somebody's role, or yourself as the ED putting together the kit, it's a significant amount of time because remember, it's looking at all the stuff, the follow-ups, the actions from the minutes from the meetings before, to follow up all the dossiers, make everything accurate and clear, and then making them available. So yeah, a lot
There's
of
a
time.
lot of work.
Yeah, I'd say it's about 3 to 1 is a rough number. It takes you three times, triple the time to prepare. For each hour of a meeting, it takes you about 3 hours to prepare it if you're going to prepare it properly. So with that in mind, it's really important that everybody reads and is up to date and has reviewed the material before a meeting. And if they're not getting that information, at the right time or in the right format. That's a whole other situation, another concern that has to be addressed. So
Yeah.
3 to 1 is roughly the number of the different boards I've worked on. Uh,
Yeah. And what I'm trying to get to here is the importance as a board member of reviewing and reading all those documents ahead of time, way ahead of time, for two reasons. Obvious, to be ready for the meeting. Also, to maybe prepare or ask questions even beforehand. I don't know about you, Rob, but I know when I was working, I was working for a nonprofit. I didn't have the ED title, but I was in charge of coordinating the organization. So, not an executive director, but same kind of role. I was responsible for reporting to the board. So, I would, put a lot of thought into making it as clear as possible. There are also board members who would call me before a meeting sometimes just to ask a clarification. Now, the important thing here is to not get into a strategic discussion one on one with a board member before a meeting, but sometimes there were questions.
sure.
So, if you're not reading the package beforehand as a board member, how can you, one, prepare for the meeting, and two, know if maybe you have some clarification questions for the ED or maybe for the board chair? Who knows? The
Yeah.
importance here, the takeaway is be prepared, read the materials prepared for the meeting for you. This will allow you to understand key issues and ask relevant questions. I wrote here in advance in case you have some. It's also a very good idea to familiarize yourself with the organization's financial statements and performance reports. Especially if you're new to the board, these two pieces, familiarizing yourself with financial statements and performance reports, might take a bit of extra time and you might have a few extra questions. If you can, ask those questions to the executive director or to the board chair before the meeting. If you can, I'm not saying keep them on the phone for 3 hours here, but you could have some questions after reading the package. So be ready to contribute to meaningful strategic discussions and decision making as quickly as possible. Read the materials. Rob, anything to add here for this first,
Just a
tip?
couple of pieces. I mean, I think
Yeah,
you've touched on most of them. A couple of pieces. First of all, we've all probably been to a meeting before when we see that somebody is looking at something for the first time, and it ends up being embarrassing for the person who's hasn't read the material or covered the material, or certainly it can be embarrassing for the chair or whoever's moderating the particular meeting. That's one thing. And the other piece you touched on, Julie, that I think is key. It is more than okay. It is just respectful to ask questions ahead of time if you have them. I mean, especially when they're unless you're intending to catch somebody off guard or to throw a bomb out at a meeting and ultimately do damage or try to embarrass or catch somebody, you really are better off to ask the ED or ask the chair or ask a colleague a question before you bring it up. That's fine to do that. It'll just allow for, I guess, richer and more accurate conversation and debate at a meeting. Because
yeah,
if the executive director, for example, knows a question is going to be coming, they could be prepared to deal with the question. Otherwise, what ends up happening is a chair, a good chair, usually, if they don't know anything about it, they'll just table it and you won't talk about it until the next month or the next meeting. So if you really want
correct.
it to be addressed, it's good to bring the question up ahead of time to make sure that it fits on the agenda. That's a key
Yeah,
piece for sure.
awesome. Thanks, Rob.
I mean, a lot
So
of
the
agendas,
second,
they won't allow you to add on the floor, right?
I know, I know, I know. Yeah, the whole idea of having a one, a recurring agenda, and second, the whole notion that agenda items will be discussed and there's no varia, right? There's
No,
no miscellaneous. It's like if the miscellaneous stuff needs to be put to the next meeting on the next agenda. Um, Another tip here another habit of an effective board member is asking strategic questions to stimulate board discussions. Don't just listen. Actively contribute to discussions. By doing what? By focusing on big picture issues rather than operational details. Unless you're on an operational board and you're in the portion of the meeting where you're discussing operations and program delivery or an activity that you're organizing, do not slip into operational details. Try to stay in the big picture issues. Seek to understand rather than impose opinions. And one very good way to do this is use open-ended questions. For example, what are the long-term impacts of this or that decision? Are there risks associated to A, B, or C initiative that we might not have thought about? Or have we thought about risk X, Y, and Z regarding this program, initiative, or funding opportunity? So asking strategic discussions to stimulate the board discussions, staying in the, and I'm just going to go back a few slides here, staying in the what above the line instead of going into the how. As a board member, if you're tempted to ask your executive director, how did you deliver such program? Discipline yourself and tweak that question to say, can you explain to the board how this initiative fits into our strategic framework, for example? So staying out of the what, staying out of the how, pardon me, to focus on the what, staying out of the kitchen, as Sonia said. Oops, sorry. The next habit that we want to talk about is, as a board member, distinguish between governance and operational management. Oh, sorry, Rob, I forgot to let you chime in here.
Oh yeah, no, the one piece there for sure is those open-ended questions are so key. I mean, nothing's worse than asking specific yes/no questions in a meeting. Asking an open-ended question, tell me more about what are the long-term, those types of things are more important. I mean, this is why journalists use open-ended questions to get people to talk about anything. You're going to get more out of your management team and out of your colleagues if you ask open-ended rather than close-ended questions. And I don't know, the direct questions, especially at a board meeting, tend to put people on the negative and the reserved side. So you'll get more out of participation with those open-ended questions for sure.
And you'll probably get people around the table thinking too, Rob.
Yes.
You've seen it.
Well, it'll make board meetings a little bit more fun too.
Yes.
And get more people involved.
Yes. So the other habit we want to tell you about is distinguish between governance and operational management. The difference between operations and governance. So staying focused as a board member on the mission, vision, and long-term goals kind of goes with what we were saying before, right? There's, everything is intertwined here. Staying focused as a board member on the mission, the vision, and the long-term goals by asking those questions, by understanding how does this initiative fit in the big picture and the risks and the this and the policy implications and the that, means or has as a repercussion trusting the operational team and avoid micromanaging daily activities. As a board member, it's important to trust the executive director. Generally speaking, every single time I say this in a training, someone says, well, what if your DG shows you that she's not trustworthy? That's not what I'm talking about here. I'm talking about trusting, generally speaking, the people you have hired to run your business, the ED. And if you have concerns about I don't know, the hiring practices that the ED is using to hire her staff. The questions that should be asked should be very broad and should be very geared towards how do our recruitment practices fit in with our organizational culture and our values and this and that. Um, the takeaway here is to distinguish between the governance and the operational side, trusting the operational team, avoiding micromanaging, and using, and if you're on a board where there are no set accountability frameworks, developing accountability frameworks to clarify roles and responsibilities. I was working with a board recently, and I was speaking with the chair of the governance committee. Um, we were talking about a policy issue, and then we kind of slipped towards the executive director evaluation process. Um, and she mentioned how difficult it had been this past spring to, evaluate the executive director, and because it's a new board. And as I was asking her questions, she said, well, no, there is no accountability framework for the executive director. No wonder they were having a hard time evaluating her. The takeaway here is use accountability frameworks to clarify roles and responsibilities. Now, am I talking about the ED's role? Am I talking about the board's role? I'm talking about all roles and responsibilities. So as a board, you should have an accountability framework for your executive director. It outlines the objectives, even sometimes the goals that are to be reached, and what span, like, how can you evaluate an executive director if you do not have an accountability framework laying out the main pieces on which he or she will be evaluated to evaluate her performance and her performance? Accountability frameworks also work for board members. There should be a framework somewhere, either in your governance policy documents or wherever, saying what the board chair is responsible for and what is the treasurer's role and what are the responsibilities that go with that role, and so on and so forth. So using accountability frameworks to clarify roles and responsibilities of the executive director and of the board and the officers. This is the main takeaway here from this slide when we're talking about accountability frameworks. Rob, anything to add?
Yeah, just two things. First of all, I think when micromanaging takes place in a nonprofit, what it actually does, I think, is it reduces the level of accountability for the executive director and their team, because it sort of gives them an out of not having to do their particular job. I liked how you summed up the trust piece rather. Yes, you trust your DG, your executive director, and the team, and if not, well, then you've got to have some sort of way to either replace them or to make them improve. So that's a key piece. And again, the accountability framework you mentioned for governance as well, and those different accountability frameworks put in place will be key for the work of the different committees of the board. For example, the HR committee, if you have one, will work on a few pieces, and accountability framework, even with risk management ties on that as well, which might be something that your finance committee might be working on if you have one, those types of things. So it's very important to define those roles through frameworks. Absolutely.
Awesome. Thanks, Rob. Another habit of an effective board member that we want you to walk away with today is to foster collaboration and active listening. I know I talked about active listening in my first habit, but it's so important that we're bringing it back here. Another way of practicing active listening as a board member is summarizing and confirming key points. Making sure you've understood what the main takeaway from the discussion is, or reiterating it just to make sure that everyone has understood. those active listening habits will go a long way for you on a board. Sometimes when someone on a board brings something back or tries to summarize something, it can sometimes, not all the time, but sometimes lead to someone saying, "Oh, yeah, thanks for summarizing like that. I wasn't sure either if I was getting this," or, "Oh, thanks for you actually just clarified something that actually makes sense." Sometimes it can also lead to another discussion because something wasn't understood the same way for everyone. So by summarizing, confirming key points, um, you can foster discussion, and you can also just foster clarity. I don't even know if I can say that. I don't even know if that makes sense, Rob. Corrige-moi
It
en
does.
anglais if you if
It,
you
it,
if you may, but
fostering clarity makes sense to me.
yeah, fostering clarity, right?
And
Um,
whoever's doing the minutes, Julie, will also thank you for
yeah,
the active listening piece.
absolutely. As a board member, yes, you might have your governance secretary coming in and saying, "Yeah, thanks for that. That really helped me out with my minutes." Um, Fostering collaboration as a board member also means promoting a culture of trust by respecting diverse perspective. Oh, I hadn't thought of that. Thanks for bringing it up. You've just brought me in another frame of thought, or that's another frame of reference that I might have not thought of. Thank you for that. Um, Promotes a culture of trust and confiance on a board. So you can be that person. I encourage you to be that person on a board. There's also the whole piece of, as a board member, fostering collaboration also means learning about the board's dynamics and past decisions before making proposals. You don't know what you don't know. There might be a decision that was made a year and a half ago before you joined the board that might surface or that you might bring up because you don't know what happened a year and a half ago. Give yourself the chance to, if you are bringing up something that has been considered before by the board, let your colleagues around the board synthesize what happened, why, what was the ends and odds and ends, and then be done with it. There's also work that can be done prior. Just going back to our piece of before reading the materials, if there is something that you're wondering about, a quick call to the ED or a quick convo with the chair about X or Y strategic initiative can prevent you from going on tangents or from bringing up proposals that have either been made, considered, or squashed in the past. So just as a new board member, just learning about the board's dynamics and some of the past decisions before making a proposal. Just go on a little fact-finding mission and say, I was thinking of proposing this at the committee meeting or whatnot. What do you think about this? Have someone with more experience than you on the board chime in. It might be useful. So just keep all of that in mind as a new board member as ways to be efficient and also to foster collaboration and tweak your active listening tendencies or habits. Rob, anything to add before I go on with the last one?
Just to reemphasize, using those best practices are going to lead to good decisions for the board. I mean, good, solid decisions. While we don't want to be at meetings forever, using these three pieces of advice will lead to non-rushed decisions and well thought out decisions. And you won't get that famous, we tried that before and it didn't work. It allows you to give context.
Correct. Thanks, Rob. And then actively engaging in the board and the organization. As a new board member, we encourage you to join at least one board committee. Most boards that we work with now, it's mandatory. You can't get away from it. So joining at least one board committee, get involved. Attend organizational events. When Rob and I were chit-chatting about the webinar, he said, you need to sometimes, you're gonna have to go to the spaghetti dinner of the mayor, and sometimes you're gonna have to sit on that dunk tank at the fair. It's just part of the deal. And if you're in a different type of organization, You might have to represent the organization when needed. For example, with empowering partners, funders, even maybe different ministers or sous-ministres or other decision makers, right? Um, Actively engaging in the board and the organization also means continuously learning about best practices in nonprofit governance. All of that will help you remain actively engaged and understand um, the board's structure, its role, and the board's role in the overall organization, if I can say it that way. Um, the board is sometimes working in the dans l'ombre, but the board is there. And a strong board where people are actively engaged and participate in the organization's activities, and a board that is continuously learning about best practices, will most likely be an involved and efficient board. So we encourage you to do that as a board member, or to foster that, or to bring it forward if it's not present on your board. Any words of wisdom, Rob, regarding actively engaging and participating in the organization's activities?
Yeah, the way I see it, Julie, we join these boards because we care about what the particular organization is doing, and we want to be involved. That means we also want to be around to help celebrate some of the successes of our organization, but that we also want to be present for some of the tough times as well. So to be there for the good times and to be there for the tough times, to be representative when needed. I think that's important as well. And I can't emphasize the importance of continuously learning about best practices in nonprofit governance and best practices within whatever area or field your nonprofit is serving.
Yeah. Let's go into the last portion of our webinar here: pitfalls, risks, tips, and impact. So, lack of preparation from the beginning. So the pitfall here is attending your first board meeting without understanding the organization and its structure. What risks happening is you'll have difficulty following strategic discussions. You might feel ineffective. You might feel like you're not having that impact that you so want to have because you chose to give your time and sit on this board. So the tip that I have for you here is read governance documents. Ask about the onboarding process, even maybe before your first meeting, and seek a mentor. The impact on you as a board member will most likely be faster integration and more meaningful contributions from the start. I'm bringing you quickly to my next slide here because I have a little tool that I've put together that I want to share with you. So I will just exit my share screen just for a second here. And I'm just going to go copy the link to the document. Oops, sorry, exit slideshow. Sorry, guys. I just want to do this very quickly. I will put a link for you all in the chat. If you click on that, there should be a window that opens that says, do you wish to create a copy? And if you say yes, you will be able to create a copy for yourself of this little checklist. So I've put a little checklist together for you to kind of help you along this whole idea of how can I be as ready as possible even before my first meeting. So if you look at this document, I called it my new board member checklist. So 3 different categories here: understanding the organization and its mission. I've put things that you can do, like you can even check it off, like read the statutes, the bylaws, the regulations, understand the mission, the vision, the values of the organization, review the key projects and programs, or ask someone about them. If the information is not being brought forward in a straightforward way, you can ask. Identify the beneficiaries and key stakeholders. Who do we serve? Who are our main stakeholders? Who are our main funders? that kind of information. The second one here is understanding your role, sorry, and responsibilities. So reading the board member role description, understanding the distinction between governance, the board, and operations, executive director, if you're in that governance model. Familiarizing yourself with the legal and fiduciary obligations of a board member, knowing the principles of due diligence, loyalty, and transparency, and so on, so forth. I do not want to keep all of you for longer than the agreed upon time. So I'm kind of going quickly through this, but the third one here is understanding governance dynamics and key interactions, learning about the governance calendar and key dates, meet with the board chair to better understand board dynamics before you even attend your first meeting, request an onboarding meeting with another experienced board member, observe discussions to gain insight into the board culture. These are all examples of things you can do as a new board member to be, as I like to say, ready to go as a board member as soon as possible. If not as soon as your first meeting, shortly thereafter. Just gonna keep going here. So you have that little tool. Hopefully it's useful for you. I have two more pitfalls to share. So the second one is relating to confusing strategic and operational roles. So the pitfall here is getting involved in day-to-day operations as a board member instead of focusing on governance. The risk here is to confuse board and management roles, which can lead to weakening the effectiveness of both. Not just weakening the effectiveness and maybe negatively affecting management's confidence and this and that, but the board's effectiveness as well can also be impacted negatively by confusing board and management roles. A tip, we've talked about this before, but I just wanted to circle back to it. You can ask things like, is this a strategic or operational discussion? And rely on your accountability frameworks. If there's something in your executive director's accountability framework and you're asking them how a certain thing is done, you might be going in the wrong direction. The question that should be asked is more, how does this fit into our strategy? How does this result affect our ability to meet such an other goal within a 6-month span? I'm just I'm bringing you here and there, but just to give you food for thought on how can you ask certain questions to bring yourself back to the governance role as a board member. The impact of this, when the board practices this, not just you as a director, but a board that supports management without interfering, ensures stronger collaboration. Better board ED dynamics is usually the result here. I'm tempted to say an effectiveness of your effectiveness as a board member is another impact, increased effectiveness of yourself as a board member. And the final pitfall that I wanted to brush on before we say goodnight, not asking questions early on. I've talked about this before. The pitfall here is believing you need more experience before speaking up. It's not because you're new that the question you have or the something that's been rolling around your head regarding strategy or whatnot, it's not because you're new that you should not ask. I think there's a timing piece here that's important. The one question as a new board member is, can I ask this to a person on the board ahead of time, or am I holding this for the meeting? Just putting it out there for your consideration, because I think the reflection, could be pertinent. So the risk here, if you hold back because you're new and you don't think you have a place to ask X, Y, or Z, you might be missing opportunities to contribute. You might also be voting on decisions without fully understanding their impact. I'll just keep it at that. A tip here for you is practicing active listening, asking open-ended questions. It's a reminder of what we've talked about before, to clarify issues, one, and also to drive discussions. As we've said before, there might be something, an open-ended question that you ask as a board member, even a new board member, can either lead to someone going in another direction and asking another question relevant to the subject, or it can also just confirm something for people around the table. It can clarify, or it can lead to other pertinent questions. So maybe just keeping that in mind can help you, give you the confidence of asking these questions. It can be intimidating, right? I recognize that. I know that as a new board member, sometimes you don't ose. Well, Rob, help me out here. You don't oser.
Oser, well, don't. You don't ask questions early on. Donc, ça veut dire oser.
I can't think of the word. Dare.
Yeah,
Merci, Nathalie. Merci, Jeanette. Yeah, you don't dare to ask, or you don't
there.
dare to bring
That's
your
right.
question or your
You're shy.
preoccupation forward.
C'est
Yeah, you're
gêné.
shy.
Yeah.
Exactly. The impact here is you can gain a better understanding of board decisions, and it can also lead to faster engagement in strategic discussions as a new board member. Rob, anything to add here to send us off regarding the pitfalls, risks, tips, and impacts that we've seen so far?
I mean, those are three of many pitfalls that you might find along the way. But the one that I really like the best is this last one. For this webinar is about new board members or members new to the board, and it's really about you're there for a reason. You were asked, you were invited to be there. You from your own goodwill, you showed up. You might have been even elected or appointed to be on that particular board. So I think you owe it to everybody involved to ask those questions. It's the ultimate of that due diligence and duty of care to ask questions. And I think if you're worried about when to ask a question and the functionality of a question and the little pieces, other board members will usually correct you on those things early on, and you'll figure that out. But don't be shy to talk to your chair, and don't be shy to talk to the ED if you have a question or you think something won't be a good question to bring to a meeting. It sets that sort of tone on how you're going to contribute to that board moving forward.
And Rob, as someone who's been in that situation, you've probably had board members come to you before a meeting and ask you questions. Did it make you
Absolutely.
think? Did it make
Or
you think less of them?
absolutely not. There's a respect there. I mean, whether it's a phone call or an email to talk about certain pieces that should or could be on a meeting, or would it be appropriate? Or do you think it's a good idea? And I know it's good when a chair gets those questions as well. I think that's really important. I mean, when you go on it, and the other piece I wanted to mention was the first pitfall as well. When you're new to a board and reviewing what that board does and what that organization does, et cetera, et cetera. You might have been on 4 or 5 different boards, but word of wisdom, when you start on a new board, hit the reset button, because
Yeah.
what you did on the other board might be very different from what this board does. And nothing upsets board members more than when you say, well, that's not how we used to do it at another board, because you're on a new board now. So getting accepted into that board culture is helpful, and to approach it. I like that checklist a lot.
Awesome. So, upcoming free trainings. I will be very practical-practic today, and I will put for you in the chat the links to, if you're interested in registering for our next 2 webinars. So there will be one on March 4th. We're going to be talking about a board of directors, volunteerism like no other, doing your part towards good governance. And March 25th, we will be back to talk about a board that makes a difference. 4 ways the board contributes to performance. Thank you, Sonia, for your kind words. And before you go, if you want to put us in the chat, your session in one word, if you can sum up our little webinar of tonight in one word, what would that be? Put that in the chat for all of us to read, and I will say, oh, awakening, interesting, wonderful. Thank you for being there, guys. Thanks for interacting in the chat. We made good use of it, so super happy about that. And I hope to see you all soon in another one of our webinars. Thanks again. Enjoy the rest of your evening.
Good evening, folks.